Hey there, it's Silver. This is Blasphemous 2. Finally, it's actually here. The first game was kind of an unexpected hit. It ended up doing really well for itself, well enough to have a free DLC with some sort of an expanded ending as well as a new sequel. And the sequel actually does take place canonically after the ending of the Wounds of Eventide DLC from the original game, although in this case although playing as the same person, technically you are in sort of a new world, or a new iteration of the world with similar problems. And it of course uses some really, really well-drawn pixel art and a lot of sort of Spanish Catholic imagery going on here, mixed with a ton of very gory pixel art, lots of blood everywhere, and of course a lot of the bosses and like larger NPCs and things looking just really unsettling in different ways. And this game definitely takes that theme from the original and runs with it and creates a whole new world of even more unsettling and strange things to see. But interestingly enough, I think the game actually sets its tone really, really early, but you don't know it yet. Because one of the first things you do before you even start the game proper is choose a weapon. There are 3 different weapons that you can choose from, and eventually you'll get them all, but you can choose which one you want to start with. This is actually a more important decision than you realize at the time, because it's not just choosing which playstyle you want to begin with, although that's of course part of it, but it's also the fact that the weapons unlock certain areas, because there are various movement capabilities that the weapons give you, and this means that you're sort of also unknowingly choosing what parts of the world you can access at first. I think this is a really interesting idea. You know, everyone of course will start in the same place, but in this game the world is really large and it's also very open. You don't really have a specific direction that you have to go at first. You're given 3 bosses and told go get them, and you can just sort of go in whatever order you want and actually face them. And the orders in which you're going to face them are going to be mostly determined by which weapons you actually have access to, because that's going to determine what areas you can actually pass through. This is pretty cool, in my opinion, because it means the weapons in the game are very fully featured. They have a lot of uses to them, and they all have kind of their own theme. There's a sword that uses various blood attacks and can actually charge up this gauge that allows you to hurt yourself a little bit in order to empower it with these big streaks of blood. And when you do it, it causes a whole bunch of extra hits to happen on all of your attacks and unlocks some extra attacks as well, so you become temporarily very powerful, but for the cost of some of your own health. It also has a parry, and if you're able to parry most attacks, it will automatically counterattack with a powerful overhead strike, and you can even unlock the ability to parry at the very last second and have a blood-empowered multi-hitting strike as like an automatic riposte. But some heavier attacks don't get the automatic counterattack because it sort of pushes you backwards. You still parry them and don't take any damage, you just don't get the counter. And you'll come across these sort of walls and floors made up of a bunch of bodies sort of grown together. And of course they're all still alive, and they're sort of writhing around, and these block your way in various places, and this is what the sword allows you to bypass. The sword has a sort of dropping mid-air attack that allows you to slam down on the ground, and of course the farther you fall, the more damage it does. And you're meant to use this falling attack on these barriers made of bodies, and it will actually destroy them and allow you to pass through. But some of them you have to be quite high up in order to actually do that, so part of the puzzle may involve figuring out how to actually get up high in that area in order to drop down and clear out this wall. You'll also get these dual swords, and the dual swords are of course very fast, much faster than any other weapon. They're a little bit short range, but they do attack very rapidly. They can build up this lightning gauge as you do consecutive hits, and once it fills up, the weapons will actually crackle with lightning and start doing extra lightning damage along with all the other damage they're already doing. So they can actually deal very high damage per second once you get them going, but taking any hits yourself resets the lightning gauge and gets rid of the bonus. You also have a dodge dash in this game. It's not a dodge roll, it's a dodge dash. It does have very brief invincibility frames, it seems like, and the dual swords have the ability to attack from the dash to do this really far-reaching lunge attack that none of the other weapons have anything quite like it. It's very powerful and really useful for covering a large distance on the ground. And the traversal ability these things have is you'll occasionally come across these statues holding these silver mirrors that are shining light in a specific direction, and if you smack the mirrors with the dual swords, then you turn into a lightning bolt and teleport in the direction that the mirror is facing, and you can even go through walls and stuff this way. So these will block off a lot of areas. Sometimes there'll be chains of mirrors heading up really high, like pits and things, and you have to actually chain multiple attacks together and teleport repeatedly to actually get all the way up. So these allow you to access all sorts of areas. This is one of the more common things that you'll find in terms of stuff that's blocking off your progress are these mirrors everywhere. And the other weapon you get, the most powerful one, is a sort of giant flail thing that's also like one of those incense sensor dealies. It does a load of damage, and it builds up your fervor gauge faster than other weapons, which is that blue gauge under your health. It's basically MP, you use it to cast spells. And it can also wreath itself in fire in order to do a ton of extra fire damage. It's like probably the highest damaging weapon in the game when it's all fiery like that, but it does cost your fervor per second to actually keep the fire going, and you can't keep it up for very long. And you'll occasionally find these big sort of silvery blue bells hanging around the place, and if you smack the bells with this weapon, then it will send out like this sound wave that will cause certain platforms and walls and stuff to manifest or demanifest, allowing you to get to places you couldn't get to previously. So you might find a big chasm with all of these little blue floaty things, and if you're able to find the bell and hit it, they'll become platforms that you can use to cross the gap. So all this means that the weapons are fully featured in terms of combat. They all have their own mechanics and their own sort of unique spin on what they do, but they also have a traversal method that actually does the classic Metroidvania thing of unlocking new parts of the world for you to go to. It's just based on your weapons instead of something like, say, a double jump or a wall climb. Although you do, of course, get those things as well, your weapons offer a lot of extra options, and I think it's really cool that the game has this really open theme. Like the whole point of the early game is that you have these three main story bosses to face, but you can do them in any order you want, and you can just sort of explore the world on your own time and see what you find, and of course find various dead ends that need weapons you don't have yet and all that stuff. And this means that in comparison to the first game, this one's world is a lot more open. It's this big, large open world that allows you to just sort of go wherever, and I think that's pretty cool. It's always nice to me in a Metroidvania when they design the world to be very non-linear, very open. So I appreciate the way that this game has designed its world to be really traversable in a lot of different ways, but also locking some of that traversal behind your classic relics, like stuff like the wall jump and things, but also your weapons. But of course your weapons aren't the only important thing to combat, because you can also have spells. The spells in this game are called prayers, and you can equip two different kinds. There's a sort of quick casting one that you have on the B button, and then there's a more powerful sort of longer casting time type of prayer that you have on the down and B button, and you can equip one of each at any given time, so you have two different prayers available to you, and there are quite a few of them, and they each do a lot of different damage types. This is the main way that you're going to be able to explore the different damage types, aside from some of the things your weapons can do, especially some other more rare damage types for you, like fire and miasma damage. These are all things that are more easily accessible from prayers. You also have the bile flasks from the first game, the Estus-like charge-based healing system. You start with only two of them, but you can quickly get a third, and beyond that you can get, I think, a few more later, but it takes a little while. I should also mention that every weapon actually has a skill tree for you to access. That's how you upgrade them and unlock new abilities for them and things. You get these marks from killing enemies. As you kill enemies, it'll fill up this purple gauge, and once it's full, you'll gain one mark. And of course, more powerful enemies are worth more progress in the gauge. You can also very rarely find some of these marks as loot in the world, like in a faraway treasure chest, or as part of the reward for like a side quest or something like that. And the main use of these marks is to unlock new skills for all of your various weapons. Although you will only have the first tier of unlocks available at first for each weapon, you'll eventually find these thingies that allow you to expand the skill trees to include up to like 3 tiers of various abilities. So you do have a limited number of these marks you can get, by the way. You can only get 40 of them from the killing enemies route, so it's pretty important to find the other ones in the world, because this allows you to sort of extend that otherwise hard cap of 40 to have a few more. The other use of these things is involved in a new mechanic that this game has, which are these little wooden figurines that you can buy and find around the world, and these can be equipped on your character. Although you only have 2 slots at first to equip these, and there are way more than 2 of them in the game, you can eventually expand to up to, I believe, 8 slots. But expanding the number of slots you have costs these marks as well. And you can find a lot of these things, and the kind of cool thing about them is they actually have a sort of resonance as well, a resonance mechanic, where if you equip 2 specific ones and 2 slots that are joined together, then sometimes they'll do something extra along with whatever it is they do by default. So you're encouraged to equip different groups of them just to see what happens, and to see if 2 of them happen to resonate and create an extra effect that you didn't otherwise have before. And they're really powerful. They tend to be really big bonuses. They can be all sorts of things, from like just flat out resistances to certain damage types, or empowering your prayers, or maybe even making it to where your guilt builds up less. That's something to explain. This is something that was present in the first game as well. The penalty for death in this game is that you build up guilt. And the more guilt you have, these thorns start to cover up your fervor gauge. and the more guilt you have, the more of it covers up, and eventually you can actually have so much guilt that you can't cast any prayers at all, so you need to get rid of it. Where you die, you'll drop a sort of blue emblem thingy that you can collect in order to alleviate some of your guilt, but it doesn't actually get rid of all of it from that death. So if you keep dying over and over, even if you were able to go back and get this emblem, you will still be building up more and more guilt over time. And there's actually a confessor NPC that you can talk to and pay him some of the currency that you get from killing enemies in order to actually absolve all of your guilt. So occasionally, if you keep dying a lot, you're going to have to go back to this NPC on a regular basis and paying him to I guess, confess all of your guilt to him so he gets rid of it for you. Although there are some other rewards related to this as well that I won't spoil. You also have your rosary, and these are basically rings. They have like ring-like effects. You know, you only start with one slot for them at first, and you can find various beads and rings and other stuff that goes on like a rosary chain. And you can also find knots and a certain NPC that you can bring these knots to, and she will expand your rosary chain. You can have up to 5 slots total once you find all the knots. So overall, that means this game has a whole bunch of different progression methods. You have the marks for killing enemies, the other tiers from killing enemies, your main currency. You've got your statuettes to buy and find, and your rosary beads to find and buy. You've got your weapon skill trees to go along. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways to make yourself stronger in this game. And there are also some other things aside from that, like the ability to gain more bile flasks, the ability to extend your health gauge, and some other things that happen at certain parts in the story depending on what you find and what NPCs you have access to. And of course, another important aspect of any Metroidvania is the enemy variety, and this game has a lot of that. The enemy and area variety are very high. Because of its openness, you'll be exploring around all over the place and find all sorts of different environments to go to, and these environments tend to have enemies exclusive to them, so each area has its own sort of theme of threats and stuff that you gotta deal with. And the enemies are really cool. Just like the first game, they are really well drawn and animated and have some really grotesque death animations. Sometimes all sorts of crazy stuff happens to them. Some enemies just like fly into skeletons out of nowhere. So it definitely has a really good enemy variety, and the fact that there are so many areas, each area having its own themes of enemies, means that you're going to be facing new stuff all the time, and you're not really going to get bored by facing the same things over and over. But of course, the star of the show here are the boss fights, just like the first game, which had some famously very difficult but also really, really visually strange and grotesque boss fights. The sequel definitely keeps that theme going, and the boss fights are really good. They are some extremely fun, well-designed bosses. Oftentimes they have multiple phases, although when they don't, they tend to have a large number of attacks to learn, so it doesn't really matter that much. And one of the bosses in particular, one of the 3 that you face at first, before the sort of second half of the game, has 3 phases and gets like really hard by the end and really hectic, and the screen is like just full of projectiles and fire tornadoes and things. But I would definitely say overall the boss design is a high point of the game. They are not only visually really interesting to look at and have some really cool pixel art associated with them, but they also have a ton of attacks to learn and some just very difficult and challenging fights that are really satisfying to beat. Like, you feel good when you beat a boss in this game because it feels like a really well-designed fight, so you have a lot of satisfaction from actually figuring it all out and having the fight click for you, you know, where like suddenly you do really well because you understand what's actually expected of you, and you get all the dodge timings down and all the phase transitions and all that stuff, and it sort of all makes sense, and you have a really fun boss fight. This game is definitely full of that feeling, that really satisfying boss fight feeling. As for difficulty, because the first game was quite a difficult one, this is a little bit different in that regard. It is relatively challenging at first. Like, the areas you have access to for the first 3 major story bosses do get pretty hard, and some of the bosses themselves are definitely pretty hard, but it's not like super crazy challenging at first. However, once you defeat all those enemies and you get to the second half of the game, there's a sudden difficulty spike and everything gets much more difficult. Even the normal enemies you're going to be facing while exploring the areas get a lot harder. So yeah, the boss fights and enemies get a lot more complex and difficult in the second half. So if you are looking for a difficult Metroidvania, then this is still going to satisfy that urge, because it's definitely pretty hard. Even though it might not start quite as hard as the first game did, it gets very challenging once you reach the big city in the sky, and things start to change a lot in terms of how the game expects you to really have learned the mechanics by that point and do a lot of weapon switching on the fly between your 3 weapons and stuff, because you have to have had them all by then, so now the game can start designing puzzles and areas around you having all this stuff. You You know, since the first half of the game can be tackled in almost any order you want, the areas are designed around not necessarily having everything, but once you get to the second half, now suddenly the game knows you have everything, so it can start making things really difficult for you, and it does. Also, the music. The music is really, really good stuff. Some of the music is just like droning environmental sounds that add a lot of really like heavy, creepy atmosphere to certain areas, but other areas have more of an actual music track, and a lot of it is like a combination of like some choir-y stuff and then some like classical Spanish stuff. It's a really neat soundtrack. I would definitely say that some of the area music and some of the boss music has stood out to me a lot as being really, really solid. So yeah, definitely the soundtrack matches the visual style of the game in terms of being like an important part of that really interesting, kind of unsettling aesthetic the game has going on. They go hand in hand with each other for sure. So my view of Blasphemous 2 is that it is an extremely good sequel. It is taking everything that the first game was known for and improving on it, or expanding it in different ways and allowing you to just experience this wider world in a variety of different ways. And it keeps up a lot of the things that people know and love, you know, from the original, including the really like show-stopping boss fights and things. And is also, in my opinion, just an example of a really solid Metroidvania. So even if you've never played the original and you're just in the mood for like a Metroidvania or like a difficult action RPG, this is just really good at that. So you don't have to have actually played the first game in order to get a lot out of this one. So yeah, super solid Metroidvania, definitely recommend, although it does get quite challenging. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check it out yourselves, and I'll see you guys next time.